right. Papa just had a dream about a wave that was coming. He was ready to rush the family home. Let's see what happens. Chapter 18, The Road Home. Pansy awoke to the sound of boxes being packed and Mama's cast iron stove being set back on the wagon. When Pansy walked out of her tent, Mama quickly told her, "We are packing to head home." This came as a surprise, but it really didn't bother Pansy too much. She was ready to see the old log cabin ranch house again. What she heard next did bother her. She could hear Papa visiting with some of the fellow campers. Pansy had rarely seen Papa's face as serious as it was that morning. Some of the men had gathered around him, and he was telling them of the dream he had and trying to warn them to get off the island. One man laughed at him and left. The others, about 5 or 6 men, stayed to listen. In the end, only Big Jim, who had become friends with Papa, gave any serious thought to leaving. All of this grown-up talk was making Pansy nervous inside. She never liked it when grown people go off and whisper to one another in order to keep their kids from knowing what's going on. Didn't they know that was worse than being told the truth ever could be? Pansy knew, though, when it was better to leave things alone and just say nothing for a while. This looked like one of those times. After packing up on the beach, they went back to the big house and loaded a few more personal items there. Then they headed to Mr. Moore's store. Papa was in the store for what seemed like a very long time. He was returning the key to the house. Later, she would learn that he was also trying to warn Mr. Moore of his dream, but Mr. Moore just kept saying, "George, we've lived here all our lives and have seen many hurricanes blow through. They do a lot of damage, but we've always survived just fine." Papa thanked Mr. Moore for the use of the house and returned his key. Pansy didn't really get to say goodbye to her friends, so she was busy writing a letter to Annie for all the kids in the neighborhood. She shared much about how she loved the last few weeks they had as friends and hoped that one day they might see each other again. Even though Pansy knew that was unlikely, by noon they were pulling out of Galveston and headed back to New Mexico. The trip back through town and across the bridge was not nearly as eventful as the first time they arrived. For Pansy, the day was both a little bit sad and a little bit happy. Maybe even just a tiny exciting. She thought to herself, there are still many miles ahead, and who knows what we might see or what might happen. With that, she jumped off the pillows at the back of the wagon and ran up to see where Papa was leading the horses. "Papa," she said, "thank you for taking us on this trip." "Papa, I love you." Papa put his big arm around her little body and pulled her next to him real close. "You guide the horses," he said, as he handed Pansy the reins. "I'm tired and want to rest for a while." Pansy's hands gripped the reins tightly as they bumped along the road, leading off the island bridge and towards the west. By now, the sun was high overhead, and the day was becoming warm. Pansy thought about how difficult it might be to sleep tonight on those old spring mattresses after living in the house on In-N-A-Half Avenue for the last 3 months. In-N-A-Half Avenue? Oh no, she thought to herself. What about Papa's dream and all my friends? "Papa?" Pansy spoke up with alarm in her voice. Papa jumped as he awoke and said, "What's wrong?" Papa grabbed the reins and Pansy surrendered them to him. "What's going to happen to all my friends on In-N-A-Half Avenue? We should have stayed and warned them," cried Pansy. Papa looked down at his daughter with caring eyes and put his arm around her. Papa spoke in a gentle voice. "Pansy, the warning was for us. God told me to get off the island, so that's just what we're going to do. You saw the reaction of the men who I was talking. Most of them ignored me or laughed it off. God will have to speak to their hearts as he did mine." Pansy seemed distressed with this answer. She spoke back to Papa. "We should go back and warn everyone, or at least our friends on In-N-A-Half Avenue." Papa paused before he spoke, but then responded to her, saying, "Pansy, a wise old deacon in the church once told me, God will put mail in your mailbox. Oh, God will put your mail in your mailbox." "What does that mean?" Pansy asked. It means that God deals with every man individually. He will have to warn others to get off the island to protect them from darkness that's coming. All the warnings in the world will most likely go unheeded. You mean there's nothing we can do? Pansy said, nearly on the edge of tears. Oh no, I didn't say that. There's something very powerful and effective we can do, answered Papa. Oh, you mean pray, Pansy replied, with a tone of sadness mixed with unbelief in her voice. Papa smiled at his young daughter. What did you learn on that island when you were lost and stranded? Papa said with a knowing look on his face. Pansy quietly gave the answer she knew was true. I learned that God really does hear our prayers. Papa smiled and said, Right. If it was true on Tucker Island, then it's true as we travel along this dusty trail, right? Pansy looked up at Papa, knowing Papa was right, but nevertheless wanting to do something more than pray. I'll tell you what, Pansy. Let's agree to pray every night for the people of Galveston Island, for whatever is coming, that God will help them and be with them, okay? Pansy looked back at her Papa. Okay, she agreed. The two of them sat on the bench of the wagon for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Papa spoke up and said, Pansy, did I ever tell you about the city man who showed up on the ranch one day? Pansy thought for a moment, then replied, No, I don't remember that story. Papa began. There was this man from a big city, some place like Chicago, I think. He came to visit his cousin in Lincoln. Now this cousin lived down the road a piece from us, but not too far. One day, I saw this city man strolling down the main road in front of the house. So I said hello to him, and he answered back. He was a right friendly man. As I remembered, he was a little overdressed for the prairie. He was all gizzied up in a suit and tie and matching vest. He looked more like a man going to a wedding than one out for a walk. So I said to him, Sir, where are you headed this morning? Here's the picture. Papa and the city man. Lincoln, he answered. I am sure I had a strange look on my face when I said to him, Lincoln, sir? Why, that's half a day's ride by horse through the Lincoln Pass. I don't intend to use the road going through the pass. I plan to take a shortcut over the mountain, he said in a determined voice. Over the mountain? I know I sounded pretty strong with my response, but I thought this man was out of his mind. I knew he didn't know the country, and he didn't realize that Captain Peak is over 10,000 feet high. I was worried he'd get lost or injured, or worse, attacked by some wild animal. Papa continued, Pansy, I spent the better half of an half hour trying to convince the city man that this was a really bad idea. I even offered to take him to Lincoln, but after all my talking, he turned toward the mountaintop and began to walk, as though I never said a word. So what happened to him, Papa? What happened to him, Papa? Pansy questioned anxiously. Papa shook his head and answered, What happened? Just exactly what I thought would happen. After about 2 days, his cousin came by asking if I'd seen him. I told him just what I told you, and we both gathered up our ranch hands, and the 12 of us headed up into the mountain looking for this yahoo. Pansy interrupted, Did you find him? We sure did, Papa said. 3 days later, half starved and freezing from the cold mountain air, he had wandered around in circles until he didn't know which direction he was going. He would have died if we didn't find him in time. Pansy thought for a minute and said, Papa, that man was not very smart, was he? Papa smiled and spoke again. No, Pansy, he was as smart as any man, maybe smarter, but he didn't understand the land he was in. He didn't understand how dangerous the mountains could be, or how things which look close in the mountains can be miles away. Papa continued, No, Pansy, he was plenty smart, but he was stubborn, and he didn't want to admit that he might be wrong or that he might not know something else, like me. Something someone else like me might know. His stubbornness almost cost him his life. So you see, we need to pray for the people of Galveston, that God will protect them and be with them. We need to pray that God will speak to their hearts, just like he spoke to mine. Okay, said Pansy. I see what you're saying. It was the man's stubbornness that got in the way of him being able to hear what you had to say. That is just the same as when our stubbornness can get in the way of hearing God's voice or His word. Papa smiled. Pansy, you're a smart girl. Pansy jumped down from the slow-moving wagon and began to walk next to Star. Star kept a close watch over her as they walked along. Pansy was still concerned about her friends back in Galveston, but it made her feel better to know that she could pray for their safety. Occasionally, she would throw a stick for Star to fetch. She thought to herself how Star never got tired of the same game over and over. The family camped that night in a small town called Alvin, Texas, which was several miles away from the ocean. Papa wanted to get as far away from the water as possible that first night, so they kept traveling down the road even past dark. There were no community campgrounds, so Papa just found a good spot under some tallow trees and made camp. Papa set up camp quickly, always checking for snakes first. Since San Antonio, because it was so late, dinner consisted of things Mama could scrape together without cooking. There was cornmeal bread from breakfast and some dried beef. These would have to do until tomorrow. Pansy climbed into her bed and pulled the covers up over her chin. Then she heard Papa's voice in her ear saying, "Aren't you forgetting something? We need to pray." Pansy climbed down, and Papa and Mama and Pansy joined hands in a little circle to pray. First, they thanked God for bringing them safely this far on the journey and for blessing them with food and supplies. Then they asked God to keep them safe as they traveled. Finally, they prayed for the people of Galveston. They asked God to spare them and help many to escape the coming darkness. Papa always called it darkness because he couldn't be certain what horrible thing was coming, but he was certain in his heart that he needed to get away. For the next several weeks, they traveled home. This would be their nightly prayer. After prayer, Mama walked with Pansy back to the bunk on the side of the wagon. Just as Pansy was about to climb up, Mama moaned, "Oh!" Pansy turned and looked, but before she said another word, Mama again said, "Oh!" "What is it?" questioned Pansy. Mama smiled at Pansy and said, "The baby is kicking me. Do you want to feel it?" Pansy reached her hand toward Mama's growing stomach to feel the thumping of the baby against Mama's tummy. Mama smiled and said, "It's definitely in there." Pansy smiled back and said, "You mean she's definitely in there?" This had become a little game Mama and Pansy played. Pansy knew that the baby could just as easily be a boy, but she was wishing, hoping, and praying for a girl. At the end of the game, Mama would always say, "Just so it's healthy." "So, how soon before the baby will be here?" questioned Pansy as she lay her head back down on the pillow. "I think about 4 more weeks, maybe 5, responded Mama. Pansy thought for a moment, then said, "But will we be back home by then?" "Probably not," replied Mama. "What will we do if the baby comes while we're still traveling? How will you be able to have a baby on the road?" Pansy spoke in worried tones. Mama answered softly, "Pansy, don't you worry. Babies are born every day. It's a natural part of life. When the time gets close, though, Papa will find a good place to settle for a couple weeks. I'll have the baby, and when I'm strong enough, we'll move back home, okay?" Pansy looked at her mama's soft face and loving eyes. The moon was shining bright, and it lit up her hair in the moonlight. It was a picture she would treasure forever. "Okay, Mama," Pansy replied. Then she drifted off to sleep. Have a good night.